Welcome to the second video on ancient Greece. Today we are going to be examining the Mycenaeans. Many civilizations flourished in the second millennium BC. The Mycenaean kingdom dominated vast stretches of mainland Greece, along with the Minoans who controlled many of the Greek islands. The civilization of Mycenaean Greece began in the late Bronze Age. So let's go over a mini timeline here so you can get an idea of the years involved. Now, if you take a look there, we see the Bronze Age started approximately. Now, I want to point out approximately. That's a key word here because we do not know for certain when the Bronze Age exactly started. So you'll see these dates get revised downwards or upwards. I think some people are saying 2900 BC now. But let's just say that it started 3000 BC and ended approximately around 1000 BC. So again, the point is the farther you go back into time, the less secure we are about the dates. And especially since you're dealing with prehistory. That is before a written history really existed. So there's nothing to tell us that this happened or that happened on this date. So you take a look at that, the Bronze Age, 3000 to 1000 BC. Now, this is a timeline on the Aegean Bronze Age. The other areas around the world also are using bronze tools and weapons. Their timelines might be a little bit different. So keep in mind that this is for the Aegean settlements. Also, when we talk about 3000 BC, we are talking about the Minoans, and that started on Crete. But the Minoans are a separate entity than the Mycenaean civilizations that we're going to be talking about. So as I said, the Mycenaeans come along at a much later point in the Bronze Age, and we'll get to that in a second. Now, the first Greek settlers, that is, we talk about Greek-speaking settlers, arrived around 2000 to 1900 BC. And we really don't know a lot about them. Again, this is prehistory. We don't have a lot of written records on what these guys were all about. It is around 1600 BC that we start to see the first evidences of a civilization, and that is the Mycenaeans. And we see evidences of buildings and a culture that is dominated by cities. And that's why we can use the term civilization. And what do we mean by that? Well, cities are a collection of people that are not producing goods directly for their consumption. So these are not the agricultural villages that we see before the Bronze Age and even during the time of the first Greek settlers. These are large cities that are controlled by a single entity and share common characteristics, both in their pottery and their language. And so that's what we mean by a civilization. Now, the Mycenaeans lasted quite a long time, approximately 400 to 500 years, which is actually quite a long time when you compare it to classical Greece, which only lasted around 200 years. But around 1200 and perhaps as late as 1050, the Mycenaeans begin to disappear out of the archaeological record. And as I said, by 1050, it's really all over. Let's move now to a map of Mycenaean Greece so you can take a look at this. Since there are no ancient historical accounts of the Mycenaeans, archaeologists and historians have had to trace the use of pottery and tombs to study the culture. And the first examples of burial sites of Mycenaean culture were found in the Peloponnese. Eventually, the characteristics of Mycenaean pottery and grave sites were seen all over Greece, in southern, central, and even to a lesser extent, northern Greece. Eventually, the Mycenaeans make it out to the islands and begin to occupy some of the Minoan cities after the Minoan civilization collapsed. We do not know the reasons why the Minoan civilization collapsed. What we do know is the Mycenaeans occupied their former residences, but we don't know if they were forced out by the Mycenaeans or what the reason is for their collapse. The capital of Mycenaean Greece was in the northeastern Peloponnese, and it was appropriately named Mycenae. And these are all the major cities that constituted Mycenaean Greece. Knossos is down here. Now, this was the first settlement, first city of the Minoan culture, but Knossos becomes a Mycenaean city after the Mycenaeans move in. And then you have Pylos over here in the Peloponnese. Athens and Thebes, two major players in classical Greece, are also Mycenaean cities during that epoch. The Mycenaean name itself was a 19th century invention. So that was the name given to this civilization by archaeologists who did a majority of the work on Mycenaean Greece during the 19th century and the early 20th century. So let's do a little bit of a recap here, and then we will break down each of these bullet points out into further detail. So once again, the Mycenaeans are a Bronze Age culture, and there you can see to the right there an example of a bronze dagger that was found at one of the sites, I believe in Pylos. The Mycenaean Civilization constitutes a series of cities, not just agricultural villages anymore, that are connected through a common language and culture, of which Mycenae is the royal capital. We also have a single ruling king, a royal house that was located also in Mycenae. There are also large stone structures, and many like the Lion's Gate still exist today and are fabulous structures that you can actually visit in Greece. And of course the Mycenaeans were Greeks, as they spoke an early form of Greek. Remember, spoken language, not written language. That was very different. And we know this by some of the writings that were discovered in the 19th century. And we will get into this in the next slide. So let's discuss the Mycenaean language. We talked previously about the Mycenaeans being Greek speakers, but the reason we know this is the discovery of the so-called Linear A and Linear B scripts. Now, I don't know why they decided to call these things scripts. Obviously, they didn't have computers back in those days. You only really need to think of this as just written text on clay tablets. Now, these tablets were fire-baked, and that is why they have lasted throughout the ages. This also means that it was likely an accident, either through an attack or an accidental fire. But it seems now that these were not intended for posterity, but were rather used for the mundane purpose of keeping track of the king's items. So it's essentially an inventory list of the king's goods. So unfortunately, as a result, they tell us little about the Mycenaeans themselves. But what they do tell us is that the king was all-powerful in Mycenaean society, as most of the tablets found are dealing with the king's items or what taxes his subjects must pay. So as you can see, there are two types of writings, and they were different. The A script comes from an earlier time than the B script. A script is the language that was used by the Minoans. The Minoan language to this day has not been deciphered, so the Minoan language remains unknown to the world. So this picture you see up here with these symbols, we have no idea what these mean. B is from a later period that has similarities to A, but was clearly different enough that it was given a different classification. This is an early form of Greek, so this directly ties the Mycenaeans to the later Greeks. Even though, and this is the key point here, the classical Greeks will use a different alphabet, the Greek alphabet, as we know from the Greek fraternities and sororities. And as a result, I think it's fair that we can definitively call the Mycenaeans the early Greeks. Okay, let's keep moving along here. Now we will take a look at Mycenaean cities and buildings. Mycenaean buildings were usually built on top of a hill, and this was undoubtedly done for defensive purposes. Whether this was to protect themselves from seaborne invaders or land invaders, we simply don't know. At Mycenae, there is also a large citadel and royal palace, and the picture you see here is the remarkable Lion Gate at Mycenae. And you'll notice some of these huge stones and some of this massive masonry that went on here. And these were constructed of huge unfinished rocks that were essentially just piled on top of each other. So obviously this doesn't have any of the degree of complexity that we see in classical Greece, structures like the Parthenon. Smaller rocks were used to plug the gap left by the larger irregular stones. Near the gate, the blocks showed more work and were squared off in horizontal courses. The heavy fortification of the gate suggests, perhaps, that Bronze Age attacks on the fortress may have been just simple frontal assaults at the gate. But again, this is just pure speculation, as we have no historical accounts of really any battle that the Mycenaeans might have participated in. And what's also kind of interesting is the classical Greeks were convinced that only legendary giants known as the Cyclops could have built such massive stoneworks. Okay, so let's move on to the Mycenaean kings. The Mycenaean kings were all-powerful, and everything was controlled by the rule of one man. So think of it as a unified culture under the rule of a king. And these were successive kings over a long and what must have been a very stable period of time. Of course, this form of government has no resemblance to the republican model of the polis in later Greek classical times. So the idea of a king ruling over all of Greece would have been something that was absolutely intolerable to the later Greeks. And we know this from the royal burial sites and circle of grave shafts that were discovered in Mycenae, which, as I mentioned before, was a central hub of the Mycenaean civilization. These royal tombs are simply massive, sometimes 50 feet wide. In them, archaeologists discovered riches consisting of jewels and golden death masks. And you can see some of those images below. You see there on the left, that's a golden death mask that was actually pulled from one of those royal tombs at Mycenae. So we move on to the Mycenaean economy. It was a palace economy, and a palace economy is where the control of goods is centralized at one place, typically a palace, and then it's redistributed as needed to the people. Redistribution because money and a currency during these times simply did not exist. So there were two main drivers in the Mycenaean economy. The first is farming. And farming, as in all of antiquity, was an essential part of the economy. Usually cities were surrounded by farmland, almost totally surrounded by farmland, and this was the primary source for food. The Mycenaeans were also not stationary. They engaged in trade all across the Mediterranean, especially the eastern Mediterranean, where many of the major empires were located. And we know this by the discovery of distinctive Mycenaean pottery all around the Mediterranean. Places such as Egypt and Mesopotamia have characteristic Mycenaean pottery and other goods. So trade made the Mycenaean civilization very wealthy and very powerful. The end of the Mycenaean story is not a good one. Around 1200 BC, something terrible happens. Mycenaean cities are either abandoned or destroyed. And it must have been really terrible because many of the cities that were abandoned are never occupied again. It is not known exactly what caused the Mycenaean collapse, but it was not relegated to just Greece. Several empires, including the ancient Hittites, go out of existence completely. The various reasons that have been attributed to the collapse are invasion, rebellion, or perhaps some sort of natural disaster. A collapse in the economy has also been cited, but whatever the cause is, the Mycenaeans disappear forever and are really never heard from again. All of those causes are pure speculation because we have no historical accounts as to what was going on at that time. And what's even more surprising is that nothing ever really carries over into what became classical Greece. It's as if the Mycenaeans never existed. So the absence of writing leads to what is called the Greek Dark Ages. And when I say the absence of writing, we know that the Mycenaeans had writing, and all of that is gone. And so we even know less about the Greek Dark Ages than we do the Mycenaean times. You might ask the question, how do we know the Mycenaeans are gone if there's no historical accounts? How do we know that the Dark Ages starts right after the Mycenaeans disappear? The answer to that question lies in a few interesting tidbits. The first is the introduction of iron weapons. And as you know, as we talked about a few slides ago, the Mycenaeans were all about bronze. And we can also take a look at the buildings. They're very different and have no Mycenaean characteristics. And the burial sites also have distinct differences. So that's pretty much it on the Mycenaeans. I hope you found this video helpful. And in the next video, we will move on to the next epoch in ancient Greek history, the Greek Dark Ages.